I'm not gonna lie, this whole thing still freaks me out. I'm writing this down not to scare you, but to tell you what really went down during my last days at Oran's Lighthouse. Maybe then you'll get why Scotland's last manually operated lighthouse is now just abandoned. Its lights gone out for good. Getting to Oran's Lighthouse was a total pain, even in broad daylight. The trail was narrow and all messed up, with loose rocks that kept falling into the waves below. The lighthouse itself was this looming thing, its once bright red and white stripes all faded and chipped away from years of salty air and wind. But its beam was still going strong, cutting through the mist, guiding ships away from the rocks. My boots crunched on the gravel as I got closer. I was nervous, sure, but also kind of excited. This was it, my new home for who knows how long. The Maritime Board was weirdly eager to fill the position. Like they practically threw the keys at me, along with this ancient manual that looked like it was from the dinosaur age. Didn't matter though, I was ready for a change. The front door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled like a mix of seaweed rust and something metallic. An old oil skin coat hung by the door, stiff and damp, and there were these muddy boots underneath it, way too big to be mine. It was like the person wearing them just disappeared. Inside, the lighthouse was a total time capsule. The spiral staircase groaned with every step I took, like it was saying, "Who dares disturb my peace?" There were water stains on the walls in weird shapes that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them from different angles. The keeper's office was on the second floor, this tiny room crammed with old stuff, a telescope with cracked lenses, yellowed nautical charts, a dusty barometer that still ticked even though the needle never moved. It was creepy as hell. And then I found the rules. They were carved into the desk, all jagged and rough, like someone had done it in a hurry with a rusty nail or something. The wood was splintered around each letter, like they really dug in deep. My fingers traced the words, and each one sent a chill down my spine to Rule 1, never leave the lighthouse after sunset. To Rule 2, if the foghorn blows more than 3 times, do naughty look out the window. And Rule 3, always clean the lantern glass before dusk. Any smudge could let them in. And Rule 4, if you hear knocking on the door after midnight, do naughty answer. No one will come this far at that hour. Tear Rule 5, once a month. Leave an offering of fresh bread and milk on the cliff's edge at sunrise. Do naughty look back while walking away. To Rule 6, if the light goes out between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., stay absolutely still until it comes back on. To Rule 7, never touch the old logbook in the drawer under the desk. And Rule 8, if you hear your own voice calling to you from outside, do naughty respond. It is not you. I stared at those carvings and I swear, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It had to be a joke, right? Some messed up prank by the last keeper, but the way those letters were carved, so deep and desperate it didn't feel like a joke. And that coppery smell, it was everywhere. It made me think of something else, something I didn't want to think about. The feeling of unease stuck with me as I climbed to the lantern room. The massive lens turned slowly, splitting the afternoon light into rainbows that danced across the walls. As I cleaned the glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the reflection of the lens, I thought I saw something move behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the empty room and the endless sea beyond. By the second night, the lighthouse felt alive. Not in a good way. Every creak of the floorboards, every moan of the wind, It was like the whole building was breathing. I spent the day working on the foghorn, my hands covered in grease as I checked all the mechanisms. It was this ancient thing, all brass and iron, and somehow, it still worked. The Maritime Board had mentioned it was due for an upgrade, but now I was starting to understand why no one had bothered. Some things are better left alone. I'd gotten into a routine, checking the weather instruments, writing down readings in the new logbook. It's not the old one, never the old one, and watching the horizon for ships. But the isolation was getting to me. My phone had no signal, and the internet was spotty at best. My only company was the rhythmic sweep of the light above and the crashing waves below. That night, the fog rolled in, thick and fast. It swallowed the cliffs and the sea until everything outside was just gray. I was in the office, going over some maintenance schedules, when the foghorn blasted its first warning. The sound echoed through the whole lighthouse. Once, twice, 3 times. That was normal, just letting ships know about the rocks. I was about to relax and grab my coffee when it blasted a 4th time. This time, the sound was different. Longer, shriller, like the foghorn itself was screaming. My hand froze. I remembered the rulers. If the foghorn blows more than 3 times, do not look out the windows. My curiosity was fighting with my common sense. Part of me was like, it's just a mechanical issue, something I missed. But another part of me, deep down, was screaming, don't look outside. The silence between the blasts was deafening. No wind, no waves, not even the usual creaks of the lighthouse. It was like the whole building was holding its breath. Then came the 5th blast, shattering the quiet. I couldn't help myself. I turned towards the window. Through the thick fog, I saw them. Tall, thin figures, moving in this weird, rippling way. I could barely make out their shapes, but their movements were wrong. Too smooth, too fast, like they were gliding instead of walking. One of them stopped right in front of the window and turned towards the lighthouse. Even though I couldn't see any features in the fog, I knew it could see me. I slammed the shutters closed and stumbled back, my heart pounding. The foghorn went silent, but then I heard a new sound. A soft, deliberate scratching against the wood, like something sharp was tracing patterns on the shutters. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the office, listening to that methodical scratching. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to check the shutters. Deep grooves were carved into the wood, swirling patterns that almost looked like words in some language I didn't recognize. The fog had lifted, but as I looked out at the calm sea, I couldn't shake the feeling that those figures were still out there, waiting for me to break another rule. By the second night, the lighthouse felt alive. Not in a good way. Every creak of the floorboards, every moan of the wind, it was like the whole building was breathing. I spent the day working on the foghorn, my hands covered in grease as I checked all the mechanisms. It was this ancient thing, all brass and iron, and somehow, it still worked. The Maritime Board had mentioned it was due for an upgrade, but now I was starting to understand why no one had bothered. Some things are better left alone. I'd gotten into a routine, checking the weather instruments, writing down readings in the new logbook, not the old one, never the old one, and watching the horizon for ships. But the isolation was getting to me. My phone had no signal, and the internet was spotty at best. My only company was the rhythmic sweep of the light above and the crashing waves below. That night, the fog rolled in, thick and fast. It swallowed the cliffs and the sea until everything outside was just gray. I was in the office, Going over some maintenance schedules, when the foghorn blasted its first warning, the sound echoed through the whole lighthouse. Once, twice, 3 times. That was normal. Just letting ships know about the rocks. I was about to relax and grab my coffee when it blasted a fourth time. This time, the sound was different. Longer, shriller, like the foghorn itself was screaming. My hand froze. I remembered the rule is, if the foghorn blows more than 3 times, do not look out the windows. My curiosity was fighting with my common sense. Part of me was like, it's just a mechanical issue, something I missed. But another part of me, deep down, was screaming, don't look outside. The silence between the blasts was deafening. No wind, no waves, not even the usual creaks of the lighthouse. It was like the whole building was holding its breath. Then came the fifth blast, shattering the quiet. I couldn't help myself. I turned towards the window. Through the thick fog, I saw them. Tall, thin figures, moving in this weird, rippling way. I could barely make out their shapes, but their movements were wrong. Too smooth, too fast, like they were gliding instead of walking. One of them stopped right in front of the window and turned towards the lighthouse. Even though I couldn't see any features in the fog, I knew it could see me. I slammed the shutters closed and stumbled back, my heart pounding. The foghorn went silent, but then I heard a new sound. A soft, deliberate scratching against the wood, like something sharp was tracing patterns on the shutters. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the office, listening to that methodical scratching. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to check the shutters. Deep grooves were carved into the wood, swirling patterns that almost looked like words in some language I didn't recognize. The fog had lifted, but as I looked out at the calm sea, I couldn't shake the feeling that those figures were still out there, waiting for me to break another rule. I spent the rest of the night frantically researching the lighthouse's history on my dying laptop. In the past century, 17 ships had wrecked on the rocks below. In every case, survivors reported seeing lights on the cliffs, hearing familiar voices calling them towards the rocks. They said the lighthouse beam seemed to guide them straight into disaster. Dawn came reluctantly, the sky a dull gray. My hands shook as I checked the calendar. It was the first of the month. Rule 5 echoed in my mind once a month. Leave an offering of fresh bread and milk on the cliff's edge at sunrise. Do not look back while walking away. I hadn't slept a wink. Michael's voice, the scratches in his handwriting, they'd kept me awake, huddled in the corner of the office. But rules were rules, and something told me breaking this one would be worse than facing whatever waited outside. The unease from the night before clung to me as I prepared the offering. The bread was stale, but it would have to do. I found an old tin pitcher in the cupboard. Its surface dull with age. The milk inside caught the dim light, its surface shimmering faintly. As I gathered the items, I noticed something odd about the pitcher. My parents long asleep. Tiny engravings around the rim that looked like waves, but as I looked closer, I realized they were actually hundreds of miniature faces, mouths open in silent screams. The path to the cliff's edge felt longer than usual. The mist clung to my legs, curling around my ankles, carrying the scent of salt, decay, and something else sweet, cloying smell that reminded me of the flowers at Michael's memorial service. Each step was treacherous. The rocks were slick with dew, and the mist made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The crashing waves below were muffled, as if the fog itself was swallowing the sound. As I reached the cliff's edge, the wind died down, and the air grew heavy, The sea stretched out before me, flat and still, like a vast mirror reflecting the colorless sky. I placed the bread and milk on the rocks, my hands shaking. The pitcher made a hollow sound as it touched the stone, like a bell rung underwater. The bread seemed to darken the moment it left my hands, as if it was aging rapidly in the salt air. "Don't look back," I whispered to myself, the rule a mantra in my mind. I turned, each movement a struggle against an invisible current. The wind picked up, carrying whispers, dozens of them, overlapping and unintelligible. My skin crawled as I fought the urge to glance over my shoulder. Then one voice rose above the others, clear as a bell. "James? Why are you leaving us?" Michael's voice again, but not alone this time. Behind it, I could hear others, our father, who died when we were young, our grandmother, my high school friend who drowned at the beach, all calling my name, all asking why I wouldn't stay. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. My feet wavered, every muscle screaming to turn around. The voices grew more desperate, more pleading. Something brushed against my back, light as a feather but cold as ice. But I remembered the rules. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, even as the whispers turned to wails of despair. When I finally reached the lighthouse door, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like cotton in my ears. Hours later, unable to bear the suspense, I returned to the cliff. The offering was gone. Not a crumb of bread, not a drop of milk remained. But carved into the rocks where I'd left them were deep grooves that formed words. THNK. U. LUTLBRKR. C. EOU neck Timon H. Below the words was the image of a lighthouse rendered in perfect detail, but in its windows were faces, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, looking out at the sea with hollow eyes. The sixth night started peacefully. The wind was gentle, and the waves had settled into a rhythmic lull. I sat in the keeper's office, surrounded by old maintenance records, trying to distract myself. My watch read 2:47 a.m. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I found myself wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe I was seeing patterns where there were only coincidences. The logical part of my mind tried to explain away the handprints, the voices, the carvings in the rocks. After all, lighthouses were known for playing tricks on their keepers' minds. I glanced at the barometer. It hadn't moved since I arrived. The needle frozen, a fair, despite the constantly changing weather. But as I watched, the needle twitched, then started to drop rapidly. The glass face frosted over despite the warmth of the room. Then, at precisely 3:05 a.m., the light went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, crushing. The familiar hum of the machinery died, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The rules flashed through my mind. If the light goes out between 3:00 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., stay absolutely still until it comes back on. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The darkness pressed against my eyes like a physical weight. My watch ticked loudly in the silence. 3:06 a.m. 9 more minutes to endure. Then came the footsteps. They started at the bottom of the tower, soft and deliberate. Not the heavy boots of a maintenance worker or the hurried steps of someone coming to help. These were slow, measured, almost delicate. Each step was followed by a slight dragging sound, like something being pulled across the metal stairs. 3:10 a.m. The footsteps reached the first landing. The temperature plummeted, my breath fogging in the air. Frost started forming on the desk under my fingers. The windows rattled slightly, though there was no wind. 3:20 a.m. Second landing. The dragging sound was louder now, accompanied by a wet, sliding noise that made my stomach churn. The darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin, probing, searching. The air took on a heavy, metallic taste that reminded me of blood. 3:13 a.m. The footsteps stopped just outside the office door. The handle rattled. I clenched my teeth, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. My watch seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Tick, tick, tick. Then my voice, whispered from the other side. "James, let me in, I need your help." The words were mine, but the tone was wrong. It was like hearing a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. Behind it, I could hear other voices, dozens of them, all whispering my name in that same distorted way. The handle turned fully, but the door didn't open. Instead, something pressed against it, making the wood creak and bend inward. In the darkness, I could see the door bulging, as if something massive was trying to force its way through. I stayed absolutely still, remembering the rules. My legs cramped from tension, and sweat froze on my forehead despite the cold. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the light flickered back to life. The footsteps retreated, faster now, almost fleeing, and the temperature began to rise. When the door finally swung open on its own, the hallway was empty, but something had changed. The light from the lantern room above seemed different, dimmer somehow, tinged with a subtle greenish hue that reminded me of deep water. And in its beam, I could see that the walls of the office were now covered in tiny handprints, as if made by children. When I checked the maintenance log later, I found an entry from exactly 100 years ago. Third time this month the light has gone out at 3:00 a.m. Each time they get closer to breaking through. God help the keeper who lets them in. After 6 days of following the rules, of resisting every urge to understand what was happening, I finally broke. The logbook, the one I was forbidden to touch, called to me from its hiding place beneath the desk. Something about last night's events had pushed me past the point of caution. I needed answers more than I needed safety. My hands trembled as I pulled it from its resting place. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, its surface marked with strange patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The binding was secured with a brass clasp that was ice, cold to the touch. The moment I broke the seal, the air in the room changed. The sunlight dimmed, and that coppery smell, the one I'd noticed on my first day, grew stronger. From somewhere deep in the lighthouse, I heard the foghorn give a single, quiet moan, like a warning. The first pages were exactly what you'd expect from a lighthouse log, neat columns of dates, times, weather conditions, ship sightings, maintenance records. But as I turned the pages, things started to change. The handwriting became more erratic, the entries less professional. Entry from 1912, the fog is alive. It moves with purpose, and I swear I saw something inside it, a shape watching. It stands at the edge of the light's reach, always just out of clear view. The other keepers say I'm seeing things, but I know what I saw. It had my wife's face, but wrong somehow. She's been dead for 3 years. The ink on this entry was brown and flaking, and the paper felt damper than it should. Entry from 1943. The knocking started again last night. It was louder this time, more insistent. They're using new voices now, the men from the fishing boat that went down last week. I can hear them drowning over and over, begging me to let them in. I fear I won't last much longer. The rules are the only thing keeping them out, but my resolve is weakening. Sometimes I think I see my own face in the crowd outside. This entry was written in what looked like green, black seaweed ink, the words slightly raised on the page. Entry from 1977. I broke the rule. I looked back at the offering. It saw me, It knows my name now. They all know my name. They're in the mirrors, in the windows, in every reflection, always smiling, always waving, always drowning. The light doesn't keep them out anymore. It draws them in. We were wrong about its purpose. So wrong. The writing here was shaky, desperate. The pages were stained with what looked like salt water, and small handprints marked the margins. But it was the final entry that made my blood run cold. To the next keeper, the light isn't for the ships, it's for them. If it goes out, they'll come, and they will take you like they took us. All of us. Every keeper before you. We're still here, you see. Still watching, still keeping the light. But not for the ships. Never for the ships. P.S. You should have followed the rules, James. Now you've read this. You're one of us. Or you will be when the light goes out. The entry was dated tomorrow. As I stared at the impossible date, I noticed something else. My own reflection in the brass fittings of the logbook. But my face was all wrong. My eyes were dark pools of seawater, and my smile was too wide, filled with things that looked like fish bones. The foghorn blew in the distance. Once, twice, 3 times. I slammed the book shut, but I could still feel it pulsing in my hands like a living heart. And somewhere far below, I heard the first footstep on the spiral staircase.